Imagine a night so dark that no one saw the river rising. A night when the quiet streets of a medieval town woke to the sound of water pushing against doors, lifting carts off the ground, and turning familiar roads into silent, shifting currents. Tonight, we're going back to those forgotten moments, the floods that reshaped entire towns, moved bridges from their foundations, and forced people to rebuild their lives one plank, one stone, one quiet breath at a time. As you listen, think about this. If you lived in a world without warnings, without weather forecasts, without levees, what sound would have woken you first? The creak of wood, the rush of water, or the murmur of your own heartbeat? Tell me in the comments. What would you have done in that rising night? Your answers help me shape the next stories we explore together. And before we drift deeper into this quiet piece of the past, don't forget to like the video. It keeps the stories flowing. And subscribe so you never miss another calm journey through forgotten history. Now let's begin. The floods that changed medieval towns. In medieval Europe, most towns were established close to rivers because rivers supplied water, powered mills, supported trade, and formed the backbone of transportation. This dependence meant that every settlement developed simple systems for observing water levels. Marks carved into stone walls, notches on wooden posts, and the experience of older residents served as the only warning tools available. On the night this particular flood began, nothing suggested danger. The sky was clear, the temperature stable, and no storms had passed through the region. The river ran normally, and the guards stationed at the bridge did not expect anything unusual during their routine inspections. Sometime after midnight, the watchman noticed that the waterline had risen slightly above the usual level for that time of year. At first, the change appeared so minor that they assumed it to be a routine fluctuation caused by natural shifts upstream. But the rise did not stop. Instead, the river continued increasing in depth at a slow but steady pace. What made this concerning was the consistency of the rise. There was no rainfall, no melting snow in the immediate region, and no wind strong enough to influence the flow. Townspeople were informed, and although many families woke up to check their surroundings, few believed the situation would become serious. Over the next hour, however, the water crept into the lowest streets of the riverside quarter. Buckets, loose boards, and small wooden crates began to float. Residents moved stored grain to upper shelves, carried important belongings to higher floors, and secured livestock as best as they could. These actions were not done out of panic. Medieval communities were accustomed to responding quickly to environmental changes. Still, the lack of any clear cause made people uneasy. Floods typically arrived with noise, force, or storms. This one advanced quietly. By early dawn, messengers returned with information collected from upstream. A section of the riverbank several miles away had collapsed, creating a partial blockage and narrowing the river's flow. This type of collapse was common after long periods of soil weakening, but without modern monitoring tools, it often went unnoticed until it affected downstream communities. Because the water could not pass through efficiently, it backed up and pressed into the town. Fortunately, the collapse had not been catastrophic. It simply restricted the river enough to cause a steady rise. As morning light spread across the town, the extent of the flooding became clearer. The entire lower district was submerged to varying depths. Houses built closest to the river had water up to their thresholds. Workshops, storage rooms, and stables had taken in water overnight. Residents used small boats to move supplies and check on neighbors. Town leaders gathered in the upper square to evaluate damage and plan their next steps. Despite the disruption, the situation remained calm. The water was not rising further, but it also was not receding. For several hours, the river held its height as if balanced at a single level. This plateau concerned experienced townspeople more than a rapid surge would have. A stable high level often meant the upstream blockage had not yet given way, and if it suddenly broke, a second, more powerful wave could follow. The council considered evacuation but decided to wait until the water showed signs of movement. People stayed alert but continued their routine actions, protecting food, moving animals, reinforcing wooden frames, and monitoring the bridge supports. By midday, the water finally began to withdraw. The drop was gradual, giving the townspeople time to move safely back into the lower quarter. As the streets reappeared from beneath the water, debris became visible: branches, silt, damaged barrels, and sections of wooden fencing. Residents inspected foundations, checked for contamination in wells, and assessed the stability of buildings. Mills remained inactive to avoid damage to their wheels, which were often the most vulnerable structures during floods. Although the flood did not cause widespread destruction, it left behind a lasting impression. Foundations had shifted in several homes, storage areas required thorough cleaning, and eroded riverbanks needed reinforcement. Town records noted the event as unusual because it occurred without rain, storms, or winds. The slow, silent rise demonstrated how quickly conditions could change due to factors happening far beyond the town's view. For a community dependent on the river, this was an important reminder that natural systems could shift at any time. The people rebuilt, reinforced their defenses, and returned to their normal routines. But the memory of that night, the night when the river rose quietly and without any visible cause, remained an example of how medieval towns were forced to adapt continuously to the uncertainties of the natural world. When the initial shock of the rising water passed, the town shifted from observation to organized response. Medieval communities, despite limited tools, were not inexperienced in dealing with floods. Over centuries, they had developed practical methods to protect their homes, their food, and their work. Although every flood was different, certain steps were familiar to almost everyone. In this town, people quickly understood that the situation might last longer than a single night, and they began implementing measures that had been passed down from older generations. One of the first actions involved stabilizing the most important buildings. The mill, the granary, and several merchant warehouses were essential for the town's economy and food supply. These structures were often built on slightly raised ground, but even small amounts of water could weaken their foundations. Carpenters and laborers placed additional wooden supports under key beams and checked the stone bases for cracks. They secured tools and materials inside, making sure nothing could float away or be damaged by moisture. For many families, the mill served not only as a workplace, but also as a source of grain, and protecting it was a top priority. Food preservation became the next major concern. Medieval towns rarely had abundant reserves, and any loss could lead to shortages. Residents began relocating sacks of grain, vegetables, and salted meat to upper rooms. Large clay pots were sealed with wax to prevent contamination. Households cooperated by sharing safe storage spaces in taller buildings. Some inns and merchant homes offered their upper floors as temporary depots for neighbors whose houses were threatened by deeper water. Such cooperation was typical in medieval life, especially during environmental hazards, because survival depended heavily on community effort. Transportation within the town also had to adjust quickly. Streets that were previously used for carts and livestock were now covered by several inches of water. People relied on small wooden boats, planks, or raised walkways made from extra boards gathered from workshops. These improvised paths were installed across the busiest areas to allow residents to move between important locations without stepping directly into the water. While modern drainage systems did not exist, medieval towns were surprisingly efficient in creating temporary circulation routes during floods. Livestock management presented another set of challenges. Animals were essential for both food and labor, so protecting them was critical. Farmers relocated their cattle, goats, and poultry to higher ground, sometimes even into public halls or in used upper storage rooms. This was not an unusual practice. Chroniclers from various regions repeatedly described situations where animals were housed in churches, barns, or administrative buildings during natural disasters. Although inconvenient, it ensured that the community did not lose vital resources. Throughout the day, the town council continued gathering information from surrounding areas. Messengers sent upriver confirmed that the collapsed bank remained in place and was causing water to accumulate behind it. They also reported increasing pressure on the weakened section. If the blockage broke suddenly, the resulting surge could reach the town quickly and with greater force. Because of this possibility, the council warned residents in the lowest districts to stay upstairs, keep boats ready, and prepare to move further inland if necessary. Meanwhile, craftsmen and laborers inspected the bridges. The main bridge, built of both stone and wood, was structurally important for trade and travel. Floodwater pressing against its sides could cause damage if not monitored closely. Workers checked the joints, observed how the supports responded to the current, and listened for any unusual cracking noises. Although the bridge remained stable, they prepared ropes and reinforcements in case the water level suddenly changed. Bridges were among the most vulnerable structures during medieval floods, and their failure often disrupted a town far more than the flooding itself. As hours passed, the town adapted to the slower pace that accompanied natural disruptions. Shops remained closed. Workshops operated only in limited capacity. Many residents stayed on upper floors, while volunteers moved between houses delivering information and assistance. The atmosphere was calm, not fearful. Medieval communities were accustomed to working through difficulties without urgency or panic. People understood that nature followed its own processes, and the best response was careful observation, cooperation, and patience. Late in the afternoon, the water level finally showed consistent signs of decline. The drop was slow but unmistakable. Residents watched the edges of streets reappear as the water retreated. Boats that had been floating freely settled again onto the ground. Workers near the riverbank confirmed that the pressure on the bridges had lessened. While the danger had not completely passed, the stabilization brought visible relief to the community. Even with the improvement, repairs had to begin immediately. Floodwater, even when shallow, caused structural weakening, contamination, and erosion. Households inspected wooden beams for warping, cleaned their storage areas, and removed debris that had collected around doors and alleys. Shops and workshops cleared mud and silt that had entered during the peak of the flood. Carpenters began reinforcing river-facing buildings, using additional planks and supports to prevent long-term damage. By evening, the town had regained a sense of order. Although some areas remained under shallow water, people resumed normal routines as much as conditions allowed. Families cooked meals, livestock settled into temporary shelters, and the council recorded the day's events in the town ledger. Medieval record-keeping often focused on practical details: the cause of the flood, the highest water level, the specific buildings affected, all of which would help future generations understand how to respond when similar events occurred again. The flood had not devastated the town, but it had disrupted it sufficiently to remind everyone how dependent they were on the river. The people realized that even a minor change upstream could influence their daily lives without warning. The experience strengthened the community's awareness and reinforced the importance of maintaining early responses, cooperative labor, and careful observation of natural patterns. By the time the sun set, the immediate danger was gone, but the lesson remained clear. Medieval towns lived beside nature, not above it. And every flood, no matter how mild, demonstrated the same truth. The river shaped the town far more than the town shaped the river. When the water finally settled into the lower quarter of the town, people were forced to adjust their routines. Flooding, even when not catastrophic, interrupted nearly every practical aspect of medieval life. Many tasks depended on movement across the streets, access to workshops, and the availability of dry storage. Once water entered public spaces, the entire rhythm of the town slowed, and residents shifted to a more cautious, measured pace. People who normally worked outdoors remained inside or on higher floors, waiting for instructions from the town officials. The first major change involved the use of public spaces. Market squares, where daily trade usually took place, could not operate as usual. Instead, merchants moved their goods to raised platforms or temporary stalls set up along the edges of the affected area. Medieval towns had no alternative indoor markets large enough to accommodate all sellers, so trade continued on a smaller scale. Many vendors sold only essential items such as bread, grain, salted food, candles, and simple tools. Less critical goods were stored away until conditions improved. This limited form of trade ensured that people still had access to necessary supplies, while the town managed the emergency. Workshops also experienced immediate disruption. Blacksmiths, carpenters, tanners, and weavers depended on ground floor workspaces. With water flowing across their floors, they had to pause much of their production. A blacksmith could not safely operate a forge in damp conditions, nor could a carpenter keep wood dry enough for stable construction. Craftsmen spent the early days of the flood protecting their materials, covering wood with cloth, hanging tools from ceiling beams, and storing leather or textiles in upper rooms where humidity was less likely to cause damage. These preventive measures saved many resources that would have otherwise been ruined. Households experienced similar adjustments. Cooking, cleaning, and routine maintenance became more complicated when families were confined to upper floors. Food preparation moved to small portable hearths or simpler cooking methods that required less space. Children were kept indoors to avoid accidents in the water-filled streets. Daily chores such as washing clothes or collecting water had to be reorganized. Some residents collected rainwater from roofs to avoid walking through the flooded quarter. Others used buckets to bring water from safer wells located inland. Every action had to be adapted to minimize exposure to unsafe conditions. Mobility across the town required careful planning. Raised walkways made from planks allowed people to cross certain streets without stepping directly into the floodwater. But these structures were narrow and only supported a few people at a time. Moving goods required additional help, and heavier items were transported by small boats. These improvised solutions created delays in almost every task. Even simple trips, visiting a neighbor, collecting supplies, or attending a meeting, took longer than usual. In medieval life, time was structured around natural cycles, and a flood disrupted these cycles significantly. Communication between different districts became increasingly important. Town officials assigned trusted individuals to travel through the streets, delivering messages about water levels, safety concerns, and updates from upstream. Because there were no centralized systems for announcements, information spread by word of mouth. This method was slow but effective, especially in small communities where residents knew each other well. People relied heavily on these messengers to make informed decisions about their activities and movements. Floods also affected the operation of mills, which were essential for grinding grain. Water-driven mills could not function properly when debris accumulated in the wheels or when the flow changed direction. Millers spent hours removing branches, silt, and broken wood from the river channels to prevent long-term damage. Until the mills were fully operational again, the town had to ration flour. Bread production slowed, and households reduced their consumption to ensure supplies would last. Such adjustments were necessary for survival, and towns accepted them as part of living beside a river. Religious and administrative duties continued, but in altered forms. Town meetings were held in the upper rooms of sturdy buildings. Community decisions were made with attention to long-term consequences. Residents discussed reinforcing riverbanks, improving the placement of grain storage, and revising emergency procedures. Floods did not simply interrupt daily life. They shaped future planning. Medieval leaders understood that nature could not be controlled, but the community could prepare more effectively for the next event. Records of the flood were written carefully, detailing dates, water levels, and affected structures. These notes became reference materials for future generations. Social behavior also shifted. In normal times, people moved through the town independently. During floods, cooperation became necessary. Neighbors checked on each other more frequently, shared resources, and arranged group tasks. When certain families ran low on dry storage space, others offered temporary shelter for their goods. Individuals who owned boats assisted those who did not. The emphasis on cooperation was not unusual for medieval communities. Mutual support was essential during any widespread challenge. As the days passed and water slowly receded, the town began transitioning back to its standard routines. Streets reappeared beneath the water. Workshops reopened, though many operated with reduced capacity. Markets returned to their original locations once the ground had dried enough to support stalls. Repair work became the next priority. Damaged beams, eroded pathways, and weakened river walls were addressed. Carpenters and stonemasons worked steadily to restore structures to functional condition. These tasks continued for weeks after the floodwater withdrew completely. Despite the difficulties, the overall atmosphere remained calm. The residents knew that living near a river required resilience. Floods were not extraordinary events. They were part of the environment. What mattered most was the community's ability to adapt quickly, protect essential resources, and resume daily life with minimal loss. The town succeeded in doing this, and the experience strengthened the collective understanding of how to respond to future disruptions. By the time the town had fully recovered, people had gained clearer awareness of their river's behavior. The flood altered how they interpreted signs from upstream, how they maintained their buildings, and how they stored their goods. The changes were practical, modest, and entirely consistent with medieval life, where survival depended on close observation of nature and cooperation within the community. When a medieval town experienced a significant flood, even if the damage was limited, the event often forced officials and residents to reconsider how the settlement was organized. Town layouts were rarely strict or pre-planned. They evolved naturally around water sources, trade routes, and available land. A flood highlighted weaknesses that people might not have recognized during ordinary conditions. Once the water receded, the town council typically evaluated which areas had suffered most, which structures had proven vulnerable, and what changes were needed to prevent similar disruptions in the future. The first and most immediate concern was the stability of buildings located closest to the river. These homes and workshops were often constructed with wooden frames and foundation stones that had been placed many decades earlier. Long exposure to moisture weakened lower beams, caused wood to swell, and put pressure on joints. After a flood, carpenters inspected houses systematically, tapping beams, checking alignment, and confirming that support posts had not shifted. If a building leaned even slightly, or if its lower frame held water for too long, repairs had to begin immediately. In some cases, residents chose to abandon the lowest structures entirely and relocate farther from the river, particularly when the cost of reinforcement exceeded what a family could afford. Streets and pathways formed the next major focus of attention. Floodwater eroded dirt roads, carved narrow channels along the edges, and dislodged stones from paved sections. Medieval roads were not engineered with drainage systems, meaning standing water could soften the ground and make it unstable for carts and animals. Once the flood receded, laborers filled uneven surfaces with gravel, replaced stones, and compacted the soil with wooden tampers. Certain narrow alleys that proved especially vulnerable during the flood were widened or slightly elevated using layers of packed earth. These changes were modest but practical, improving movement through the town and reducing future risk. Riverbanks themselves required substantial maintenance after every flood. Towns usually employed workers responsible for shoring up weakened banks with logs, woven branches, and piled stones. These reinforcements did not stop floods, but they slowed erosion and helped keep the river within its typical boundaries. After a significant flood, Officials often decided to extend these supports further downstream or upstream, depending on where water had caused the most damage. This type of gradual improvement, built over many years, shaped the long-term evolution of a town's riverfront. Storage practices also changed. Because floods frequently damaged grain stores, salted meat, and essential goods, residents sought safer ways to protect their supplies. Many households began constructing raised platforms inside barns, allowing sacks and barrels to rest above the normal floor level. Merchants reinforced their warehouses with thicker doors and placed shelves higher. In some towns, wealthier families built small stone storage rooms on elevated ground to safeguard their most important resources. These changes reflected a collective understanding that food security depended on better preparation. Floods also influenced where new buildings were allowed to be constructed. Although formal zoning laws did not exist, local authorities sometimes established informal guidelines after major floods. For example, towns might discourage new homes from being built on the most vulnerable lowland sections. Markets, workshops, and inns serving travelers were often relocated to slightly higher areas to prevent future disruptions. Even minor landscape changes, such as building a structure 1 meter further upland, could significantly reduce the risk of repeated flooding. Over time, such decisions contributed to the gradual upward expansion of many medieval towns. Bridges were another critical point of attention. A flood placed heavy pressure on supports, carried debris that could weaken structural joints, and altered the flow of the river around the piers. After a flood, masons examined each stone carefully, removing silt and repairing cracks. Wooden pedestrian bridges, which were lighter but more fragile, were often rebuilt entirely if water had soaked their beams for too long. The condition of bridges influenced trade, communication, and military defense, making their stability one of the top priorities after any high water event. Wells and water sources had to be checked for contamination. Floodwater carried soil, debris, and sometimes waste into areas close to the ground. If a well became compromised, it needed to be drained, cleaned, or sealed temporarily. Water quality was vital for cooking, brewing, and daily use, so maintaining safe wells was a matter of both health and routine. In some towns, new wells were dug farther from the river after a major flood to reduce the risk of contamination in future years. Additionally, towns often reviewed their emergency procedures. Medieval communities relied heavily on coordinated action, and each flood exposed weaknesses in organization. Afterward, councils might assign new watch posts, create additional storage for boats and planks, or designate specific families or individuals responsible for spreading alerts. These adjustments made the community more resilient. Though medieval towns lacked the technology of later centuries, they developed strong social systems that compensated for it. Educational value was another overlooked consequence of floods. Each event helped younger generations learn practical lessons about their environment. Children watched adults reinforce walls, move livestock, inspect beams, and repair roads. This knowledge was absorbed naturally. By adulthood, most residents understood how to prepare for environmental risks without formal instruction. In the long term, repeated floods shaped the physical character of a town. Some low-lying sections gradually transformed into storage zones or grazing areas rather than residential districts. Higher ground became more densely populated. Workshops moved toward safer locations. Pathways were adjusted to route traffic around vulnerable areas. These shifts were not centralized or planned all at once. They developed slowly, influenced each time nature tested the town's structure. Thus, while a single flood might seem like a brief event, its effects reached far into the future. Medieval towns evolved through many small responses rather than large transformations. Each flood left a mark, not dramatic enough to erase a community, but significant enough to shape how it grew, how it organized its spaces, and how it prepared for the next time the river rose beyond its expected boundary. When a medieval town experienced a flood, One of the most significant consequences was the interruption of travel and trade. Roads, bridges, and river routes formed the core of a town's connection to surrounding regions. Even a moderate rise in water could limit movement for days or weeks, creating delays that affected everything from food distribution to communication. Because most medieval communities operated on tight resource cycles, any disruption had immediate and noticeable effects. The first area impacted was the network of roads extending outward from the town. Medieval roads were not paved except in rare major centers. They were primarily packed, dirt mixed with gravel. When floodwater covered the surface, the ground softened quickly. Heavy carts could sink into the mud, and animals such as horses and oxen struggled to gain traction. Travelers approaching the town often had to halt miles away, waiting for conditions to improve. Merchants transporting grain, wool, salt, or timber delayed their journeys, unsure whether the main routes into the town were safe. As a result, scheduled deliveries were postponed, and supplies entering the town decreased temporarily. Bridges posed additional challenges. Even if a bridge remained structurally sound during the flood, officials often restricted its use until the water fully retreated. Wooden planks became slippery, joints swelled from moisture, and debris carried by the river could strike the supports unexpectedly. Town guards stationed at the bridge informed travelers of the conditions and sometimes directed them to wait outside the town. In cases where the bridge was known to be at risk, authorities placed wooden barriers to block entry and prevent accidental crossings. Medieval bridges lacked the engineering reinforcements of later centuries, so caution was necessary even after minor floods. River trade, which formed a major part of local economies, was also interrupted. Boats transporting goods upstream or downstream could not approach the usual docking points when the water was too high. Rising currents increased the risk of collisions with submerged obstacles or shifted posts. Boatmen, who relied on experienced judgment to navigate these rivers, would anchor at safer distances and remain there until the current stabilized. A delay of even a few days could affect markets downstream that depended on timely shipments of agricultural products or crafted goods. Postal messengers and official couriers faced delays as well. Communication between towns already required significant time. A flood added uncertainty to the journey. Messengers who carried legal documents, tax records, or administrative orders had to choose alternate routes or halt travel entirely. This slowed administrative functions at both the local and regional levels. When communication was delayed, decisions concerning land ownership, property disputes, or market regulations sometimes stalled, leaving residents without timely guidance. Trade fairs, which were essential economic events in medieval life, could be postponed or reduced in scale if flooding occurred near the scheduled date. These fairs attracted merchants from distant regions, encouraging the exchange of goods such as cloth, spices, tools, and metals. If roads or bridges were compromised, merchant turnout declined, and the fair produced limited activity. For some towns, this created a noticeable dip in revenue, since these events were valuable opportunities for taxation and fee collection. Local commerce inside the town slowed as well. Craftsmen who relied on imported materials faced shortages when shipments were delayed. A blacksmith expecting shipments of iron or charcoal might have to reduce production. A weaver whose wool supplier was stuck on a flooded road would restrict output until supplies resumed. Tavern keepers, bakers, and brewers faced similar difficulties if grain shipments were delayed for too long. These small disruptions added up, influencing both daily life and local economic stability. Livestock trade also experienced complications. Drovers transporting cattle, sheep, or pigs along major routes often had to stop at temporary camps outside the town, since animals could not cross flooded sections of road. Prolonged delays increased the risk of illness among the animals, required additional feed, and sometimes caused economic losses for both the traders and the town expecting the arrival. Despite these challenges, Medieval communities had strategies to minimize disruptions. Merchants carried extra provisions on long routes to prepare for delays. Some roads were built slightly higher than the surrounding land to resist flooding. Towns positioned secondary docks along sturdier banks where boats could anchor safely during high water. Wealthier merchants who frequently traveled invested in sturdy wagons designed to navigate difficult terrain. Although these precautions could not prevent disruptions entirely, they helped reduce the economic strain associated with floods. Another important adaptation was the informal network of communication among merchants and travelers. News about road conditions, bridge stability, and river levels spread not through official announcements, but through conversations at inns, markets, or stopping points along trade routes. Travelers often shared recent observations, enabling others to adjust their plans. This exchange of information made the medieval travel system more flexible than it might appear from a modern perspective. When the floodwater finally receded, travel and trade resumed gradually. Roads required time to dry, boat routes needed evaluation, and bridges underwent inspection. Traders moved cautiously at first, making sure the routes were safe. Some markets reopened with limited participants, waiting for resupply to normalize. Within a few weeks, most activities returned to their usual rhythm. In the long term, floods influenced the development of more reliable infrastructure. Over generations, towns adjusted road placements, strengthened bridges, and created alternative paths for merchants. These improvements emerged slowly, often in response to repeated disruptions. Each flood acted as a reminder of the landscape's challenges and encouraged residents to refine their methods for managing movement and trade. The medieval world operated without modern engineering, but it compensated with experience, cooperation, and adaptability. Floods disrupted travel and commerce, yet communities learned from each event, using the lessons to strengthen their routes and systems. In this way, even routine flooding became part of the continuous process that shaped the practical design of medieval towns. Floods in medieval towns did not only disrupt buildings, trade, and travel, they also created immediate challenges related to health and sanitation. Although medical knowledge at the time was limited, people still understood that standing water and damp conditions led to problems. The lack of modern sewer systems and waste management meant that any rise in water could easily introduce contaminants into living spaces. As a result, floods often forced communities to adopt short-term hygiene measures to minimize sickness. One of the earliest concerns after a flood was the condition of wells. Wells served as the primary source of drinking water in medieval towns. If floodwater entered a well, it carried soil, debris, and sometimes waste from streets and storage areas. People recognized that water became unsafe when it changed color, taste, or clarity. After the floodwater receded, residents examined their wells carefully. If contamination was suspected, the well had to be drained using buckets or mechanical devices such as simple pulley systems. This process could take many hours, but it was necessary to restore safe drinking water. Towns with multiple wells relied on those unaffected while repairs were completed. Another sanitation issue involved waste pits and latrine areas. Many households had simple pits dug behind their homes, sometimes covered with wooden planks. During a flood, these pits could overflow or leak, spreading waste across the ground. This increased the risk of infection and forced families to relocate their outdoor sanitation areas afterward. Town laborers often added fresh soil on top of contaminated ground to reduce odors and allow everyday activities to continue. Although these solutions were basic, they represented the best practices available in that era. Food safety became a priority as well. If floodwater entered storage rooms, it could spoil grain, vegetables, dried fish, or salted meat. Residents inspected their supplies carefully, discarding any items that had absorbed water or showed signs of mold. Even a small amount of contamination was considered dangerous because spoiled food caused immediate illness. Families who lost large portions of their stores often relied on neighbors or community stockpiles. Wealthier merchants sometimes distributed limited amounts of grain to prevent shortages, knowing that widespread hunger would ultimately harm the town. Dampness inside homes presented a more subtle challenge. Medieval buildings, especially wooden ones, retained moisture after a flood. Interior walls, floors, and household items remained damp for days or weeks. In winter or cold climates, homes dried slowly, creating uncomfortable living conditions. Although medieval people lacked knowledge about bacteria or mold, they recognized that lingering moisture caused sickness, coughing, and long-term respiratory problems. To address this, residents opened shutters, lit additional fires, and spread items outside when weather permitted. These simple steps helped reduce the effects of prolonged dampness on health. Livestock health also became a concern. When animals were confined to higher floors or temporary shelters, sanitary conditions deteriorated quickly. Farmers made efforts to maintain clean bedding, remove waste, and provide dry straw, but space limitations made this difficult. Prolonged exposure to damp air or contaminated feed could weaken animals, reducing their productivity. Because livestock represented essential economic value, milk, labor, meat, wool, protecting their health after a flood was as important as safeguarding human well-being. In towns with medical practitioners, basic guidance was issued to residents. Although medieval medicine lacked modern scientific understanding, healers advised people to avoid drinking questionable water, to keep living spaces as dry as possible, and to limit contact with stagnant pools. Herbal remedies were used to treat digestive issues or fevers that appeared after floods. Apothecaries distributed mixtures intended to strengthen the stomach or reduce symptoms of illness. While not always effective, these practices reflected the community's attempt to manage risks with the knowledge available. Public spaces required attention as well. Once the water receded, mud and debris covered streets and central areas. This created a slippery, unsanitary environment. Town workers cleared fallen branches, animal waste, and damaged goods. They used shovels and brooms to reduce standing water and piled debris in designated areas outside the town. This cleanup process could take several days, depending on the severity of the flood. Keeping the streets clean was essential for preventing long-term sanitation problems. Many towns created temporary restrictions to maintain health standards. For example, markets selling perishable goods might reopen later than usual to ensure that remaining food was safe. Bakers inspected their flour stock before preparing bread. Brewers checked the quality of water before resuming production. These precautions helped reduce the risk of illness spreading through contaminated products. Although simple, they demonstrated the community's understanding that health and sanitation required coordinated effort. Floods also influenced long-term public health planning. Some towns decided to relocate their waste pits farther from living areas or construct them on higher ground. Others improved drainage routes by clearing small channels along roads or reinforcing pathways that allowed water to flow away from homes. While these improvements were basic compared to modern systems, they contributed meaningfully to sanitation. Towns that experienced repeated flooding were often more disciplined in maintaining clean streets, debris-free alleys, and reinforced riverbanks. Finally, floods reinforced the importance of shared responsibility. Health and sanitation were not individual concerns. They required cooperation among neighbors. People worked together to clear streets, clean wells, and support families who lost their supplies. Medieval society depended heavily on community bonds, and natural events like floods strengthened these connections further. Through collective effort, towns minimized the health risks associated with high water and ensured that daily life could resume safely. By the end of each flood cycle, residents understood more clearly how their environment influenced their well-being. While their medical knowledge was limited, their practical experience allowed them to manage sanitation effectively enough to prevent widespread illness. This balance between caution and cooperation formed a crucial part of medieval resilience. When a medieval town faced a flood, one of the most important responsibilities fell on the authorities. Maintaining public order, ensuring cooperation, and directing resources effectively were essential tasks. Without organized leadership, even a manageable flood could create confusion, uneven distribution of supplies, or unsafe behavior. Because medieval communities relied heavily on clear routines, any environmental disruption required swift and structured decision-making from those in charge. The first step taken by officials was to establish reliable communication channels. In the absence of written announcements or centralized notice boards, town criers and designated messengers delivered instructions orally. These individuals walked through the streets, calling out warnings, updates, or rules. They informed residents about rising water levels, the condition of the bridges, and which areas needed to be avoided. This system worked efficiently since medieval towns were compact, and most people recognized the voices of official messengers. Accurate communication helped prevent accidental crossings into dangerous sections of the town. Authorities also organized patrols to monitor behavior in the flooded areas. These patrols consisted of guards, experienced laborers, or trusted volunteers familiar with the streets and river conditions. Their main responsibility was to prevent residents from entering unstable buildings, weak riverbanks, or deep water. Some patrolled with lanterns during the night, guiding people who needed to cross affected districts. These patrols ensured that travel remained orderly and reduced the risk of injury or dangerous curiosity near hazardous zones. Resource management played another central role. In times of disruption, access to grain, clean water, and livestock feed became limited. Officials oversaw the distribution of community-held reserves to ensure no household received more or less than necessary. Special attention was given to families living in the most affected areas or those who had lost stored goods. Wealthier citizens were sometimes asked to lend nearby warehouse space or contribute supplies temporarily. Although not legally required in most towns, such cooperation was encouraged to maintain stability and reduce tension. Coordination with craftsmen was equally important. Carpenters, masons, and laborers possessed valuable skills that could mitigate damage. Authorities directed them toward priority locations: the bridge supports, the riverbank reinforcements, the wells, and the storage buildings containing essential goods. Assigning tasks efficiently ensured that urgent repairs were addressed first. Skilled workers often collaborated with unskilled volunteers, forming teams capable of completing tasks more quickly than any single group could manage alone. Public safety regulations were sometimes introduced temporarily. Officials might prohibit lighting fires in lower sections due to the risk of wetwood producing excessive smoke or causing accidents. Movement across certain streets could be restricted, especially near buildings showing signs of structural weakness. Children were instructed to stay indoors, and livestock movement was controlled to prevent animals from entering damaged pathways. These restrictions were communicated clearly and enforced gently to avoid unnecessary conflict. Local leaders also coordinated evening gatherings to provide residents with updated information. These meetings were usually held in the upper floors of administrative buildings, inns, or guild halls. Representatives from each neighborhood reported the conditions in their districts, allowing officials to evaluate the overall situation. Decisions based on these reports included directing more workers to certain areas, clearing new pathways, or preparing evacuation points if the flood showed signs of worsening. Even though medieval towns lacked formal emergency planning methods, these gatherings served as ad hoc strategy sessions that kept the community organized. In cases where the flood lasted longer than expected, authorities worked closely with religious or community institutions that possessed additional storage or shelter space. Large halls, unused chambers, or meeting rooms sometimes housed families whose homes had become uninhabitable. Although these arrangements were temporary, They ensured that no one remained without safe lodging. In return, displaced residents often assisted with cleanup or other communal tasks. Town officials also documented the event carefully. After managing the immediate crisis, they recorded water levels, structural damage, and the timeline of the flood's rise and decline. This information became part of the town's historical record, used to guide decisions in future years. Adjustments to building rules, road placement, or storage practices often stemmed from these written accounts. While medieval records varied in quality, they served as valuable references for understanding long-term risks. Maintaining public order also meant managing expectations. Officials emphasized that recovery required patience, cooperation, and practical thinking. They discouraged hasty rebuilding attempts that could lead to unsafe structures. Labor was directed methodically, not rushed. Markets reopened only when safe for vendors and customers. Each step in restoring normal life was planned to reduce risk and support fairness. The flood also demonstrated to officials the importance of training and experience. Those in leadership positions gained first-hand knowledge about flaws in the town's layout or existing preparations. They used this experience to improve emergency responses. Some towns appointed more watchmen to monitor river changes. Others created simple signal systems, such as bell patterns, to alert residents quickly. Certain councils instructed families to keep essential items stored upstairs in every season, not only during floods. By the time the flood ended, the authorities had managed to maintain order through a combination of communication, structure, and community cooperation. Their efforts prevented panic, reduced losses, and ensured that recovery began smoothly. Although medieval officials lacked modern tools or scientific understanding, they compensated with organization, discipline, and practical judgment. Floods were unavoidable in a world shaped by rivers. But with leadership that guided the community calmly and clearly, medieval towns were able to respond effectively, preserve stability, and rebuild with greater resilience than before. When a medieval town endured a flood, the recovery process for its economy required methodical, steady work. Medieval economies were small, closely connected systems where nearly every workshop, storage room, and household contributed to the functioning of the community. Even a brief interruption created visible gaps. Fewer goods in the market, reduced production from craftsmen, delays in shipments, and temporary shortages in certain supplies. Because of this, economic recovery became one of the main concerns once the water retreated. The first financial impact emerged from damaged goods. Grain soaked by floodwater lost its value immediately. Wood warped and became unsuitable for construction. Leather, cloth, and dried foods were prone to spoiling after exposure. Merchants inspected their warehouses carefully, determining which items could still be sold and which had to be discarded. These assessments shaped the town's initial economic outlook. If essential goods were lost, the town prepared for tighter resource use until new supplies arrived. Wealthier merchants who retained intact stock often played a major role in stabilizing the town by making additional goods available for purchase or trade. Craft production resumed slowly. Workshops relied on specific materials. Blacksmiths needed coal and iron. Carpenters needed dry timber. Potters required clay and stable ground for kilns. After a flood, these materials had to be inspected, re-dried, or replaced. Some craftsmen temporarily shifted their work to restoration tasks, reinforcing beams, repairing wheels, or rebuilding damaged doors. This was a practical decision because repair work was in high demand after a flood, ensuring income for laborers even when their usual production could not resume. Over time, as conditions improved, workshops returned to their standard operations. Markets recovered step by step. At first, vendors brought only basic items to the market square: bread, grain, vegetables, tools, and essential household goods. Luxury or non-essential items remained in storage to avoid unnecessary risk. Buyers approached cautiously, aware that certain goods might be scarce or priced higher due to limited supply. As trade routes reopened and merchants resumed travel, market activity increased. Fresh produce, tools, textiles, and imported items slowly returned, helping restore the town's sense of normalcy. The town's financial administration also played a key role. Taxes were often adjusted temporarily to reflect the damage suffered by households or businesses. In some towns, authorities reduced or postponed tax collection for the most affected families to prevent further strain. Guilds, which oversaw professional trades, created internal support systems that allowed craftsmen to borrow materials or funds to restart production. These systems were simple but effective, ensuring that skilled workers could resume their trade without being overwhelmed by losses. River-based trade routes required additional time to normalize. Boat traffic could not resume until debris was cleared, water levels stabilized, and docking areas strengthened. Merchants traveling long distances waited for confirmation that the river was safe before sending shipments. Once navigation became reliable again, upstream and downstream towns exchanged news and goods more frequently, accelerating economic recovery. Medieval trade relied heavily on trust and consistency in routes. Once these were restored, commerce improved steadily. Agriculture also influenced the recovery process. Floods could enrich soil in some areas while damaging crops in others. Farmers assessed their fields carefully. If the flood left behind nutrient-rich silt, planting could yield strong harvests later in the season. If fields were waterlogged for too long, planting had to be delayed or adjusted. Farmers collaborated with neighbors to share seeds, tools, and labor. These cooperative efforts helped stabilize the food supply and reduce the economic shock of the flood. Labor allocation shifted during the recovery period. People who typically focused on specialized tasks participated in communal reconstruction. Stoneworkers, carpenters, and general laborers cooperated under the direction of town officials to rebuild walls, reinforce streets, and restore damaged riverbanks. This cooperation ensured that essential infrastructure returned to working condition quickly. After these tasks were completed, laborers returned to their usual work, gradually restoring the town's economic rhythm. Inns and taverns, important for hosting travelers and merchants, reopened once roads and bridges became reliable. These establishments supported the town's income by providing food, lodging, and meeting spaces. Restoring these public venues was a key step in attracting traders back into the settlement. A functioning inn signaled to merchants that the town was stable again, encouraging commercial visits and increasing overall economic activity. Medieval economies often relied on long-term memory and adaptive habits. Floods were not rare events, and communities learned which goods to store securely, how to protect tools, and how to rebuild quickly. Over time, towns refined their economic practices, storing grain on raised floors, reinforcing key warehouses, and diversifying trade routes to reduce losses. These incremental improvements allowed each generation to build resilience gradually. By the time full recovery was achieved, the town had not only restored its economic stability, but also strengthened its understanding of how to respond to future disruptions. The experience of managing shortages, reallocating labor, and repairing essential assets reinforced the community's capacity to navigate challenges. Medieval economic life depended on steady adaptation, and each flood provided lessons that shaped how towns protected their livelihoods. Ultimately, the recovery of a medieval town's economy was not dramatic, but systematic. Through cooperation, careful planning, and steady work, the community restored its routines and prepared for whatever changes the river might bring in the years ahead. As medieval towns endured repeated floods over the years, many long-term changes gradually emerged in how communities organized their daily life, their infrastructure, and their use of land. These changes were not immediate or sudden. Rather, they accumulated slowly as townspeople absorbed the lessons each flood brought. Over decades, The landscape, social routines, and economic practices of the town shifted in ways that made the community more resilient to future events. One of the most notable long-term changes was the relocation of housing. Many families who lived in the lowest areas of the town chose to rebuild their homes on higher ground after experiencing several floods. These relocations did not occur all at once, but over time, as financial means allowed and available land permitted. Gradually, the upper districts became more populated, while the lowest streets were used increasingly for storage, workshops, stables, or public spaces less affected by temporary high water. This redistribution of living areas helped reduce the overall number of households vulnerable to future flooding. Infrastructure improvements also developed in a gradual but meaningful way. After each flood, residents reinforced riverbanks using stones, woven wooden structures, or earth mounds. These reinforcements expanded with each generation, eventually forming semi-permanent barriers that guided the river more predictably. Although medieval engineering was limited, these incremental measures strengthened the town's defenses. Over time, some towns established simple levee-like structures or elevated footpaths in areas that had proven vulnerable. These changes emerged from practical experience rather than formal design. Street layouts evolved as well. After multiple floods damaged the same narrow alleys or low pathways, the town council sometimes voted to widen, elevate, or reroute streets. These modifications reflected a growing understanding of how water flowed across the settlement. Roads that once led directly toward the river were redirected to prevent water from channeling into central squares. Areas where debris consistently accumulated were cleared more frequently or equipped with shallow drainage channels. These adaptations made future recoveries easier and reduced the impact of floods on daily movement. Markets shifted gradually too. Merchants recognized which parts of the town were consistently safe from water damage and which areas required more caution. Market squares, storage areas, and trade stalls moved slightly uphill, ensuring better protection for valuable goods. Once these new locations proved reliable, they often became permanent. The town's commercial center thus slowly migrated toward higher ground, shaping the overall structure of the settlement in lasting ways. Floods also influenced agricultural practices. Farmers observed how floodwater affected soil quality and adjusted their planting strategies accordingly. Land that frequently absorbed nutrient-rich silt became preferred for certain crops. Conversely, areas prone to long-standing water were avoided or converted for grazing. Over time, the agricultural zones around the town were reorganized based on these patterns. This subtle reshaping of farmland optimized yields and reduced losses during seasons when the river rose unexpectedly. Community preparedness improved steadily as well. Families developed habits that helped protect their belongings, storing valuables on upper floors, keeping essential supplies sealed in clay jars, and maintaining boats or planks for emergency mobility. These practices became part of the local culture. Children grew up learning where food should be stored, how to secure livestock, and which paths remained safest during a flood. This generational transfer of knowledge strengthened the town's collective readiness. The structure of governance also adapted. Monitoring the river became a more formal responsibility. Towns appointed additional watchmen during certain seasons or required regular inspections of upstream conditions. Councils created simple guidelines for building construction near the river, advising residents to reinforce lower beams, use raised floors, or build stone foundations when possible. Although these guidelines were not enforced through strict laws, they shaped community decision-making over time. Some towns even adjusted their economic focus in response to recurring floods. If river trade became unreliable, merchants diversified their activities by investing in road-based commerce or local production instead of relying solely on long-distance shipments. When floods revealed weaknesses in imported goods supply, craftsmen began producing more tools or household items locally. These shifts strengthened economic independence and reduced vulnerability to transportation delays. Repeated floods also influenced public spaces. Areas that frequently flooded were no longer used for residential buildings. Instead, they became open grounds, pasture land, or places for storage that could withstand temporary water coverage. Over time, these spaces served a practical purpose by preventing damage to essential structures. The gradual transformation of lowland zones into functional, low-risk areas showed how communities reinterpreted the landscape according to experience. Finally, the mindset of the community changed. Residents came to accept floods as a regular part of life rather than unusual disasters. This acceptance shaped behavior. People planned ahead, stored essential goods with caution, and treated each flood as a predictable seasonal challenge rather than an unexpected crisis. The combination of practical knowledge, improved infrastructure, and inherited experience allowed the town to navigate future floods with greater efficiency and less disruption. By the time several generations had passed, the town had evolved significantly due to its repeated encounters with high water. The settlement looked different, functioned differently, and responded more effectively to environmental pressures. These long-term adaptations demonstrated how medieval communities learned through experience and gradually reshaped their surroundings to coexist with the river that both sustained and challenged them. Over time, medieval towns developed a deep cultural awareness surrounding floods. Even when an individual flood did not cause severe destruction, its effects remained in the memory of the community. These memories shaped stories, records, habits, and local customs. The purpose of remembering was practical rather than emotional. Floods were part of life, and the lessons they brought needed to be preserved for future generations. In a world without formal scientific understanding or modern engineering, memory itself became a protective tool. One of the key ways towns preserved these experiences was through written records. Chroniclers, clerks, or literate members of guilds documented the dates, water levels, and consequences of each flood. These accounts were often simple and factual, focusing on how high the water reached, which buildings were affected, and how long recovery took. Such documentation served as a guide for officials who needed to plan repairs or improvements. Over decades, these records accumulated into local archives that provided a clear pattern. Which seasons posed the greatest risk, which parts of the town were consistently flooded, and what strategies had proven effective in previous years. Oral memory played an equally important role. Many medieval residents were not literate, so information was passed through conversation, family instruction, and community gatherings. Parents taught children where to store food safely, how to react when the river rose, and which areas should be avoided during heavy weather. Elders shared accounts of past events, explaining how certain structures were rebuilt or why specific routines existed. This collective knowledge ensured that even those with no direct experience of major floods understood the risks and appropriate responses. Oral tradition provided continuity in a world where environmental challenges could recur at any time. Architecture also reflected long-term memory. Builders applied techniques learned from earlier events, reinforcing structures that had failed in previous floods. If a particular workshop suffered frequent water damage, future builders constructed similar buildings on higher foundations or moved them entirely. Stone foundations became more common in areas close to the river, replacing purely wooden ones that proved vulnerable to moisture. Over generations, these small adjustments shaped the town's overall layout, making it more resilient without requiring any formal planning documents. Daily customs incorporated flood awareness as well. Some households routinely stored a portion of their essential goods on upper floors regardless of season. Tools, textiles, grains, and preserved foods were placed on raised shelves or inside sturdy containers. Families kept planks, ropes, or small boats accessible during the months most prone to flooding. Market vendors built stalls that could be disassembled quickly if necessary. These simple habits reduced losses during future floods and reflected a long-standing understanding that preparedness was part of normal life. Community cooperation was another tradition reinforced through memory. Each flood reminded residents that survival depended on helping one another. Over time, people formed expectations about mutual assistance. Farmers helping move livestock, craftsmen repairing weakened structures, and merchants sharing storage space. These informal agreements formed a dependable social structure. Even without written rules, communities operated with the understanding that aid would be offered when needed. This shared responsibility strengthened the town's resilience and reinforced the value of collective action. Religious or civic ceremonies sometimes emerged to mark the start or end of high water seasons. Although these were not complex events, they provided a communal moment to acknowledge past hardships and prepare for potential challenges. Officials used these gatherings to communicate important information, such as the reinforcement of certain riverbanks or changes in storage locations for emergency supplies. These small traditions helped keep flood awareness active in the minds of residents without relying solely on written instructions. Long-term memory also shaped economic choices. Merchants diversified the goods they stored to reduce losses from unexpected water damage. Farmers selected crops better suited to soil that frequently absorbed silt from floods. Tradesmen kept replacement materials ready for reconstructing common damage points, such as doors, floors, or beams. These adjustments reflected a practical recognition that floods would continue to influence economic stability. Rather than resisting this reality, medieval towns adapted their economic decisions based on accumulated knowledge. Over generations, the identities of medieval towns became intertwined with their experiences of flooding. Residents could often describe past events with clarity, which year the river rose higher than usual, or which season produced unusually strong currents. This familiarity did not eliminate the challenges posed by floods, but it helped communities respond with confidence rather than fear. The towns understood the rhythm of the river and acknowledged its role in shaping local life. By maintaining written documentation, oral tradition, structural adjustments, daily habits, and cooperative customs, medieval towns ensured that the lessons of one flood were not forgotten before the next. Each generation benefited from the practical knowledge gathered by those who came before them. Floods remained a regular challenge, but they no longer represented an unpredictable threat. Instead, they became manageable events that the community approached with preparation, organization, and steady discipline. In this way, memory served as both protection and guidance. It allowed medieval towns to develop resilience across decades, shaping not only their physical structures, but also their cultural outlook. The river continued to rise at times, as it always had, but the community met each event with a deeper understanding drawn from the past, a silent, steady knowledge passed from one household to the next. Thank you for staying with this quiet journey through medieval floods and the towns that adapted to them. If this calm look into the past helped you relax or taught you something new, feel free to leave a comment and tell me which part stood out most. Don't forget to like the video to support the channel and subscribe so you won't miss the next gentle chapter of forgotten history. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next story.